for Nietzsche are going to be shown to be Christian phenomena through and through. That would be getting a bit far ahead of ourselves. I want to return to our orienting question. How did Christian morality secure such a total victory? And the clue is going to lie for Nietzsche in the words that these two religions use to evaluate. Christian morality, slave morality, evaluates things good and evil. Pagan morality evaluates things good and bad. So Nietzsche is a philologist. That's the discipline that he received training at. And philology is the study of the development of languages. And what Nietzsche finds when he looks at master morality, good and bad, is that the word good has its roots very similar to the words noble, aristocratic, high-minded, privileged, whereas the word bad is associated with words plain, simple, common. For example, the German word for bad is very similar to the German word for plain and simple. And what that tells Nietzsche is that master morality, when they evaluate, their first act of evaluation is self-affirmation. They are the masters. They look at themselves and they say, I'm privileged, I'm an aristocrat, I'm beautiful, I'm powerful, I am good. And then they turn to the slaves and they say, well, you're none of that. And so you're bad, you're plain. Again, bad is not the presence of something in the way that evil is. Bad is the absence of something. But the slave morality does not evaluate in this way. Slave morality establishes the word evil first. And Nietzsche's key insight is that what the slaves label as evil is precisely what the masters label as good. Because the slaves are jealous of the power of the masters. They're envious, they're resentful. Again, think back to my own example. Think back to the example of my progressive acquaintance. It's precisely what the masters label as good. Because the slaves are jealous of the power of the masters. They're envious, they're resentful. Again, think back to my own example. Think back to the example of my progressive acquaintance. And so, they turn these virtues into vices. Ambition becomes greed, appetite becomes gluttony, sexual prowess becomes lust, confidence becomes pride, strength becomes wrath. Okay, so where does slave morality get its concept of good? We know how it got its concept of evil. It gets its concept of good by simply flipping whatever the masters are. So you're powerful and assertive, I'm going to turn the other cheek. You're beautiful and sensual, well, I value chastity and virginity. You're strong and vivacious, well, tough luck, buddy. The meek will inherit the earth. You are wealthy and privileged, well, it'll be harder for you to enter heaven than a camel through the eye of a needle. The slaves, they don't hold values for their own sake, but only as a moral weapon against the masters. Again, think back to my progressive acquaintance. What's core, what's primary for him is his hatred of the rich. And so whatever is the opposite of that, it doesn't matter. Is it socialism? Is it communism? Is it welfare? It doesn't really matter. Whatever is the opposite of that, he's going to align himself to. So for Nietzsche, this is the big difference between the master and the slave mode of evaluation. The master defines good in himself. Whatever is not that is bad. The slave defines evil in the master. And whatever is the opposite of that is good. And the slave mode of evaluation for Nietzsche is going to be the origin of both Christian morality and egalitarianism. And he wants us to see its perversion. He wants to change our tastes through three ways. The first is by pointing out the internal psychology of the slaves. The slaves, they're negative. They're naysayers, right? Because their primary act of evaluation is to say, power, bad. Beauty, bad. Wealth, bad. Privilege, bad. They don't stand for anything. They only stand against things. And as a result, their own internal psychology is of a seething hate. It's of loathing. It's of envy. So what about the master's internal psychology? Well, the masters, they're yes-sayers, right? Their first act of evaluation is to say, I'm awesome, I'm beautiful, I'm strong, I'm rich, this is awesome. And what this surplus of confidence provides for the master is that the master becomes somewhat indifferent, a cool nonchalance to the external world. He embraces danger. He's not easily offended at all. And even when he commits atrocities, he walks away cheerful. I quote to you Nietzsche. Masters step back into the innocence of the beast of prey conscience as jubilant monsters, who perhaps walk away from a hideous succession of murder, arson, rape, torture, with such high spirits and equanimity that it seems as if they have only played a student prank, convinced that for years to come, the poets will again have something to sing in praise. The picture that Nietzsche paints of the master is of this joyful brute. And he is a brute, okay? So he's very stupid, partially because he's never had to use his intellect. But what's positive here is his naivete, okay? The fact that he doesn't overthink things. And if you think Nietzsche is exaggerating with that quote I just gave you, that's literally how the Iliad begins. Achilles commits murder, arson, rape, and all he can think about is his own reputation, his own immortal glory. So the best way to think about Nietzsche's master is your high school jock, okay? He's a physical specimen. He's on top of the social pecking order. He loves danger, extreme sports, drunk driving, body checking people in hockey. He bullies people, not because he's mad, but for him, it's fun to shove someone into a locker. And you can call all manner of obscenities to his face, partially because he's so smug and confident, partially because he's too stupid to realize what you're actually saying. That might sound a very negative ideal for us, partially because we have been influenced by Christian morality, but it's the naive self-assurance, okay? It's the willingness to indulge in one's simple desires. It's the natural independence. That's the first reason that makes this masterly mode of evaluation preferable to the slave. The second reason that slave morality is despicable for Nietzsche is that they promote bad values. And Nietzsche wants to ask, how can you not promote bad values? You've simply taken what the master's like and you flipped it. By the way, that's also the answer to the question why there are two competing moral systems in the West. It's because the Christians literally took the Greco-Roman way of evaluating things for Nietzsche and flipped it on its head. And Nietzsche would say, let's just look at the type of people associated with these different religions, and that's going to tell you everything you need to know about them. Who created the Greco-Roman myths? Well, it was the aristocrats, right? Aristocratic artists. Virgil, Sophocles, Aeschylus. Who created Christianity? Who wrote the Bible? Well, the Hebrew Bible is by a group of people who repeatedly suffered enslavement and exile, and the New Testament is written by a group of persecuted Jews. Okay? Nietzsche would ask, who is Greco-Roman myths for? Who are they for? Well, they're for the aristocrats, right? People like Caesar. They claim direct ancestry from Aeneas, from these myths. Who's Christianity for? It's emphatically, it wasn't for the aristocrats, right? The Roman senatorial elite were the last to convert. In the first 300 years, the early adopters of Christianity, the lower classes, the middle classes, marginalized people, like women and slaves. Okay? Who were the Greco-Roman myths about? Well, they were about these larger-than-life aristocratic warriors, Achilles, Odysseus, and even more powerful gods like Zeus, who flew around everywhere zapping people with thunderbolts. Who's Christianity about? It's about the victim. It's about Moses, not the Pharaoh. It's about Abel and not Cain. It's about Joseph and not his brothers. Christianity, Nietzsche would say, the Greco-Roman myths are by victors, for victors, about victors. Whereas Christianity is by victims, for victims, about victims. And he wants to ask you, is there any doubt why such a religion would emphasize meekness, chastity, poverty? And is there any doubt why our culture, that has been so sufficiently influenced by Christianity, is so victim-obsessed? I mean, today, in political conversation, how do you gain the moral upper hand? You start by listing out all the ways you're a victim, right? As an immigrant, I think this. As a minority, I think this. As a working single mom of 20, I think that. That's Judeo-Christian. That's not Greco-Roman. How does Achilles introduce himself? I'm Achilles, son of Peleus. You start by listing your noble ancestors, right? You start by listing all the ways you're a victor, not a victim. But the even bigger issue for Nietzsche is that when slave morality elevates things like mercy, like chastity, like poverty, That's not what they're really advocating for. I quote to you Nietzsche in his own words. The inoffensiveness of the weak one, cowardice itself, which he possesses in abundance, his standing at the door, his unavoidable having to wait, acquires good names here, such as patience. It is even called virtue itself. Not being able to avenge oneself is called not wanting to avenge oneself, perhaps even forgiveness. For Nietzsche, the slaves aren't merciful. They're too weak to seek revenge. They aren't chaste. They're too ugly to get laid. They aren't patient. They're too cowardly to act. Nietzsche's point is that you can't confuse impotence for virtue. I want to take a step back here and just point out something interesting, because the Christian thinker René Girard also came to the exact same conclusion, that at the heart of Christianity, what made it special was that it emphasized the victim. It protected the victim. But of course, given that he's a Christian thinker, he sees that as a reason that Christianity is true and not as a reason to critique Christianity, as Nietzsche does here. And it's actually structured as a very brilliant and compelling critique of Nietzsche, which I'm not going to go into now, but I'll link my lecture in the description below if you want to watch that later on. We need to turn to the third issue that Nietzsche highlights with slave morality, and that's hypocrisy. And there's no better expression for Nietzsche of this hypocrisy than Christian love. Nietzsche thinks that Christian love purports to be this voice of objective justice, but is really just the pagan desire for vengeance in another form. And the way that he's going to make this argument is quite clever. He's going to latch on to a strand of theological thought that conceives of God's punishment, even God's punishment, as a manifestation of God's love. That makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? We punish people all the time who we want to be better. We punish our kids so that they morally improve. We punish our employees because we want them to be better. What Nietzsche's going to focus on is a specific type of punishment. Punishment in the afterlife, punishment in hell. What's the purpose of God's punishment? Are you going to still tell me it's love? Even if these people have no possible outlet of improvement? That's the wedge where Nietzsche smells hypocrisy, and he's going to cite three influential Christian writers to make his point. The first writer that Nietzsche cites is Dante, who writes on his gates of hell, "I too was made by eternal love." If you read the Inferno, you know there's not a lot of loving going down there, right? It's a torturous hell. And so why? Why is that love? Some theologians think that when you desire sin, what you're desiring is to be away from God, and therefore the Inferno is really giving you what you want, and so that's why it's love. But Nietzsche's not convinced at all. Nietzsche says, you're telling me I'm getting impaled by a spike for all of eternity with no possibility of moral progress because God loves me? What Nietzsche reads instead into the structure of the Christian afterlife is the pagan desire for vengeance, and he cites his second thinker, Aquinas, to make his point. Thomas Aquinas, the great teacher and saint, "The blessed in the kingdom of heaven," Aquinas says meekly as a lamb, "will see the punishments of the damned in order that their bliss be more delightful to them." Nietzsche's reading here of Aquinas is that the saints in heaven are like spectators in an otherworldly coliseum eating popcorn and laughing and pointing out at all the sinners being punished in heaven. Now, I think this is a terrible misreading of Aquinas, especially if you read the passages here around the Summa. But the third thinker that Nietzsche cites, I think, is the most compelling of them all, and that's Tertullian. So Tertullian did end up breaking from the church. However, he still remains one of the most influential early Christian writers. He introduced the word Trinity, and he's still considered by Christians today the father of Latin theology. Okay, so this isn't just some random guy that Nietzsche just pulled out of a hat. So what I'm going to read you now is Nietzsche's selected quotation of Tertullian talking about how excited he is in watching the sinners be punished. "That last day of judgment, how vast a spectacle then bursts upon the eye! What there excites my admiration, what my derision, which sight gives me joy, which rouses me to exultation? As I see so many illustrious monarchs whose reception to the heavens was publicly announced, groaning now in the lowest darkness with great Jove himself. And those governors of provinces too, who persecuted the Christian name in fires more fierce than those with which in the days of their pride they raged against the followers of Christ. What world's wise men, besides the very philosophers, in fact, who taught their followers that either they had no souls or that they would never return to the bodies which at death they had left, now covered with shame before the poor deluded ones as one fire consumes them. Poets also, trembling not before the judgment seat of Rhadamanthus or Minos, but at the unexpected Christ. I shall have a better opportunity then of hearing the tragedians' louder voice in their own calamity, of viewing the play actors much more dissolute in the dissolving flame, of looking upon the charioteer, all glowing in his chariot of fire, of beholding the wrestlers, not in their gymnasia, but tossing in the fiery billows. Unless even then, I shall not care to attend to such ministers of sin, in my eager wish, rather to fix a gaze insatiable on those whose fury vented itself against the Lord. Nietzsche wants to ask you, does that sound like love? So those are the three reasons why that Nietzsche dislikes slave morality and elevates master morality. Slave morality is life-denying, it promotes bad values, and it promotes bad values that the Christians themselves don't even believe in. Now, slave morality is indeed going to invert the values of master morality, but it has one more trick up its sleeve, which is that it invents the notion of freedom, free will, to further blame the masters and praise themselves. And Nietzsche makes this point by using the famous picture of birds of prey, okay, so eagles and hawks hunting little lambs. So this is the famous sentence that describes the psychology of these lambs, how the lambs react to being hunted. The lambs say among themselves, "These birds of prey are evil." And whoever is as little as possible a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, isn't he good? What Nietzsche is trying to do here is to show you how ridiculous it would be if lambs blamed eagles for hunting them, and how even more ridiculous it would be if lambs praised themselves for not hunting other lambs. Why is it ridiculous, Nietzsche thinks? It's because moral blame, moral praise, requires you to have been able to do otherwise. It requires the idea of free will. But of course, it's in the nature of the eagle to hunt, and it's in the nature of the lamb to be hunted. The lamb couldn't even hunt if it wanted to. So the lamb invents this idea of choice, of free will, to further praise itself and blame the eagle. Now, of course, in this analogy, in this metaphor, in this imagery, the lambs, they're the slaves, the birds of prey, they're the masters. And Nietzsche's view is that slavish and masterly humans are just as different from each other, this is his inegalitarianism talking, as eagles are from lambs. And just like animals, it is our natures, it's not our free choice, that determines our actions. The masters are naturally strong, and they can't help but bully people, rape, burn, and pillage. And the slaves, they're naturally weak. Again, don't confuse incompetence, impotence for virtue. And so they couldn't even do that if they wanted to. The strongest reading of Nietzsche here is that he doesn't believe in free will at all. Remember when I said in the beginning of the lecture that there's actually quite a humble and sober answer to his questions in his autobiography, Why I'm So Clever, Why I'm So Wise? This is that answer. Nietzsche thinks that he was fated to do this. And that's humble, again, because Nietzsche doesn't praise himself for being so clever. He's just fortunate. So in the master mode of evaluation, without this idea of free will, people are fortunate or they're pitied. They're pitiful, which is why the master actually has a lot of compassion for the slave. It's only when you add in free will does this idea of blame come into play. Nietzsche's attack on free will, whole other can of worms, and it's super interesting. How does Nietzsche reconcile his agential theory with no free will? How does the will to power guy not believe in free will? I'm not going to go into that right now, but I filmed an interview with one of the world's leading Nietzsche scholars, which again, I'll link in the description if you're interested. The key insight I want to emphasize here is that free will, again, is what makes something praiseworthy or blameworthy. Vegetarians don't blame lions and eagles for eating meat. They blame us because we can do otherwise. And that's what Nietzsche's getting at here. So the slaves not only invert the system of morality, they add this notion of free will. And I really want to emphasize just how significant this is, okay? That Nietzsche thinks that resentment, our psychology, not only can determine our position on values, is chastity good, is chastity bad, it can actually determine our metaphysics, is there free will or not. So I quote you Nietzsche, "Every great philosophy so far has been the personal confession of its author in a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. In short, that the moral or immoral intentions in every philosophy constitute the true living seed from which the whole plant has always grown. In fact, to explain how the strangest metaphysical claims of a philosopher really come about, it is always good and wise to begin by asking, at what morality does he aim?" What Nietzsche is saying here is that it is our interests, it is our psychology, it is things like resentment that affects philosophy, that determines our philosophical worldview. The example we've already discussed, it's because the lambs want to blame the eagles. That's why they invent this notion of free will. It's not because they started from first principles and reasoned that free will is true. This, I think, is one of the most important insights of this book, because the implication is ad hominem arguments, where you criticize not the thought, but the thinker, or at the very least, you look at the thinker for how the thought was formed, is not only valid, but it's necessary. They're necessary, again, because we don't reason from first principles, because we don't start from empiricism, but because our ideas are helplessly shaped by our interests, by our psychology. And this is why Nietzsche had to spend so much time discussing who the master was, what his psychology was, and who the slave was, what his psychology was. And I want to suggest that this extends even to the most philosophical of minds. So Nietzsche asks, not in the Genealogy, but another book called Twilight of the Idols, he asks, why does Socrates like ideas so much? Why does Socrates devalue the material world? Why does Socrates elevate an abstract realm of forms? Nietzsche's answer is that Socrates is ugly. I quote to you Nietzsche. "Socrates was a plebe. We know, we can even still see how ugly he was. The anthropologists among criminologists tell us that the typical criminal is ugly. Monster in face, monster in soul. When a foreigner who was an expert on faces came through Athens, he told Socrates to his face that he was a monster, that he was harboring all the bad vices and desires. To which Socrates simply replied, 'You know me, sir.'" What Nietzsche wants to say here is this: if I had the ugliest nose, but the biggest brain in all of Athens, I too would spend all my time thinking. I too would devalue the material world and elevate this world of abstract ideas. I too would rank beautiful bodies as less beautiful than contemplating the idea of beauty. I too would suggest the philosopher king. That's how deeply this runs for Nietzsche, that even the shape of Socrates' thought is determined by who he is, his ugliness. And that's why, again, the ad hominem isn't just valid, it's necessary for us to properly understand the thought. All right, let's summarize what we've covered so far in part 2. Slave morality inverts the value system of the masters, and it introduces this idea of free will, which further blames the masters, praises themselves. And that's the answer, at least one of the answers, for why Nietzsche thinks Christianity won. It's by inverting the Greco-Roman value system, the pagan value system, that they were able to appeal to the resentment of the vast underclasses that felt disenfranchised from pagan religion. I don't find this totally convincing, and I want to start laying the seeds of why that is by asking you guys to start considering this question. For egalitarian movements, socialism, communism, Christianity, feminism, is resentment the essence of these movements, or is it merely a likely perversion? Now, before I tell you my own answer to this question, there's another account, there's another mechanism by which slave morality appealed not just to the slaves, but also the masters. That's the aesthetic ideal. That's what we're going to investigate in this next part 3. So before I introduce you to the aesthetic ideal and what that means, there's a new class in this war between master and slave that I need to introduce you to, and those are the priests. And there's 3 important things you need to know about the priests. The first is that the priests are the leaders of the slave revolt, okay? And they're leaders because they share a common attribute with the slaves, which is that they're sickly. When Nietzsche calls the priests and the slaves sickly, he does mean physically ill, he does mean that they're timid, but what he really has in mind is sickly of spirit, that they're negative, they're gloomy people, they're naturally depressive. That's one way to think about it. So these priests, like the slaves, don't have the same natural lightheartedness of the masters. What they do have, this is the second characteristic you need to know, is something that neither the slaves nor the masters have, which is that they're very smart, they're very interesting, they're very intelligent. And so even though Nietzsche is ultimately going to side against these priests, he's a lot more complimentary than you think, because those were the group of people that made man interesting. The third quality is that the priests also share a quality with the masters themselves, and that is that they have very strong will to power. So will to power is a central idea in Nietzsche. Let me read to you how Nietzsche describes it in his own words. Every animal instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can vent its power completely and attain its maximum in the feeling of power. The interpretation of the will to power, there's many, that makes the most sense to me, is that more often than not, even if we're not aware of it, we do most things out of a desire to increase our feeling of power. So it's not a blanket metaphysical thesis. It's not even a blanket psychological thesis that everything is will to power. It's simply the much more reduced but still interesting point that more than meets the eye is motivated out of power. So those are the three qualities of the priests. Like the master, they have strong will to power. Like the slave, they're sickly. Unlike master and slave, they're very smart. And the closest approximation we have to priests would be someone like the intellectual today, especially the progressive intellectual, right? Someone who sides with the victim against the oppressor. So the priests are going to have their own ideal, and Nietzsche calls that the ascetic ideal. Also a version of slave morality, but it has a different emphasis and focus than this good and evil mode of valuation we discussed in part 2. The ascetic ideal seeks to deny oneself of all the natural desires of life, food, water, sex, sleep, pleasures, but also to deny oneself of the social desires, money, reputation, honor. So just like the good and evil scheme, this is a form of slave morality because it's about limiting the ego, right? It's about making oneself more egoless. But it has a different emphasis because the good and evil scheme, primarily the emphasis is social, whereas this is a lot more individualistic. It's about denying oneself. So what you should have in mind here when he says ascetic ideal, think mystics, Buddhist mystics, Sufi mystics, a Christian monk who goes into the desert for 30 days to pray. Okay, obviously, the first question we need to ask is, how is this the will to power? You said the priests have high will to power, but their primary thing is to deny themselves. How is that will to power? It's high will to power in two ways. The first way is that asceticism is the way by which the slaves convince others of their political legitimacy. So an example of this is one of my favorite TV shows, Game of Thrones, has this character called the High Sparrow. So the High Sparrow was the leader of one of the most powerful religious sects in the capital city, and he would always be really out of place in every scene he was in because he was surrounded by the political elite, right, amongst the aristocrats who were decked out in these elegant outfits, but he was always wearing rags. And he was always shown to be doing menial labor, like sweeping the floor, and his rhetoric is a lot more humble. Oh, this is for the people, this is for the gods. But Nietzsche's point, and anyone who has watched that show knows, it's precisely his powerlessness that gives him his political power. It's asceticism itself that provides him his political legitimacy in ruling that religious sect. And the mechanism is this. If you see someone who has denied life's most important desires, sex, money, reputation, honor, even food, then you think, well, he must have gotten something else, right? He must have transcended. He must have gotten a higher ideal. So that's how this mechanism works. That's how denying oneself is an act of securing political legitimacy. Here's another example, and it's a personal one, and it comes from the Tibetan monastery that I practice in. So every few weeks, you would have an opportunity to ask one of these great living masters who, is selfless, secured his enlightenment, a question. So it's like office hours. But it's a lot more ritualistic than office hours. So what you've got to do is you enter the room, and you got to do a prostration. You know what prostration is? You put your hands like this, go like that, you kneel on the floor, bang your head to the ground. That's kowtow. That's one prostration. You do 3 prostrations, you wobble feebly in front of the master, you kneel on the floor, the master's sitting in his good golden cushion chair, and then you get to ask your single question. That's also how we're going to do our Q&A today, by the way. And I think if Nietzsche saw me do that, he'd just want to slap me in the face and say, this is the guy you're trying to learn how to be selfless from? This is the egoless guy? And Nietzsche's critique would be, the Tibetan Buddhists, they can talk about egolessness, they can talk about compassion all they want. Look at the society they built. Look at the feudal order. Look at the large serf class they had serving these supposedly selfless nobles. Look at their system of corporal punishment. Look at their hierarchical rituals. You can't even get a question out without kowtowing 3 times. Nietzsche's critique is that the feudal theocracy of Tibetan Buddhism is propped up precisely by their aestheticism. So it's not a cessation of desire. It's actually willing very strongly. I think that's a good critique. I think that's an interesting critique. I think it goes a bit too far. I don't think it's just will to power, but I'm going to save the reasons for why I think so, again, into the last section. So that's the first way in which the aesthetic ideal for Nietzsche represents a will to power, right, a form of social control. But Nietzsche's surprising insight, or his surprising claim, rather, is that even for the ascetic, who's meditating by himself, no sociality whatsoever, in the forest, even that is will to power. And that represents will to power because it represents the ideal situation, the ideal conditions under which the ascetic priest can pursue his great project. Now, how this actually works is going to be a lot more easily understood when we look at the philosopher first, right? Because the philosopher, again, the intellectual, also participates in this priestly ideal. So what we're going to do now is we're going to first examine how aesthetic ideals helps the philosopher do his great project, and then we're going to go back to the ascetic ideal in the ascetic. I quote to you Nietzsche. Poverty, humility, chastity. Look at the lives of all great fruitful inventive spirits close up. One will always find all 3 to a certain degree. Certainly not, as goes without saying, as if these were their virtues, but rather because their supreme lord, philosophy, demands it of them. Demands prudently and relentlessly. He has a mind for only philosophy and gathers everything, time, energy, love, interest, only for this. Saves it only for this. Nietzsche's point is this: poverty, chastity, humility. The philosopher does not choose these because he's virtuous. He chooses these because these are the conditions that allows him to do his great work. So let's take poverty, for example. The philosopher's orientation is not to make money. He's not focused on making money. Even if you offered him possessions, he's not going to want them. Why? Because having possessions comes with obligations. It comes with demands. So he didn't choose to be poor because it's virtuous. He chose to be poor because that's not his focus in life. That's not where he directs his will to power. Now, obviously, we want to push back against Nietzsche here and say, but isn't having truth-seeking rather than money-making as your primary goal, isn't that virtuous? And Nietzsche's going to say, there's a lot of issues with truth-seeking as your primary goal, and we're going to talk about that very soon. But even if it were more virtuous to live a truth-seeking life than a money-seeking life, that's not why the philosopher chose it. The philosopher chose it because his dispositions, his circumstance, his resources better suited him to exercise will to power in the domain of truth. So I've had a lot of personal experience here where I've been up close and personal with the top intellectuals as well as the top capitalists in the world, and they hate each other, right? The capitalists think the intellectuals are poisoning the well of ideas, and the intellectuals think the capitalists are hoarding all the resources. And they see a vast chasm of difference between each other. But when you get up close and personal, especially when you look at the elite of both, the similarity, I think, and I think Nietzsche is right here, is greater than the difference. They all have that maniacal focus. They all have that unrelenting drive to succeed, to win out. They all have a super strong will to power. And I suspect that Nietzsche is right, that the only thing that made them go one way or the other is not because, I don't know, capitalism can help everyone, or because truth-seeking is the most virtuous life. It's because their dispositions, their circumstance, their relationships, their resources better predispose them to exercise their will to power in one domain rather than the other. Okay? And the same story goes with humility. Philosophers are not more humble because they're moderate. It's the exact opposite. Their immoderate pursuit of the truth is why they are humble, because they don't want to get bothered by people. Okay? So that's why they don't advertise themselves. That's why they don't splay their name on things. Chastity, the last virtue, I think is the most interesting. So Nietzsche asks us, why are so many of the great philosophers chaste? They don't have wives. Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Rousseau. I mean, Socrates had a wife, but Socrates literally chose the most annoying woman he could find to test his resolve, right? So that doesn't really count. So that's the question. Why do philosophers not get married? And I think Nietzsche has a very interesting answer here. It's because most people get married to have progeny, to have kids, right? To have their name live on. But the philosopher already has a channel for his name to live on, and it's through his books. So again, it's not like the philosopher is more enlightened. It's not like the philosopher no longer cares about his name living on after his own death. It's that he's found a better will-to-power route to exercise that same desire. So the ascetic ideal of the philosopher is an expression of the will to power because it's by rejecting the usual demands of life, money, sex, name, that the philosopher can fully devote himself to truth at all costs. That's what his ascetic ideal is. Truth at all costs to life. I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but only because it's so interesting. Nietzsche thinks we got this ascetic ideal, truth at all costs, from Christianity. And you can see how it's a religious idea, right? That I'm going to be pursuing a transcendental ideal, namely truth, against all other demands of life. I'm going to sacrifice sex, I'm going to sacrifice family, reputation, just for truth. That's a Christian idea for Nietzsche. If that's the case, then the ascetic ideal, truth at all costs, is also what gave birth to science and atheism. So think about the early atheist writers. Think about the early scientists like Galileo and how much persecution, how much life they needed to sacrifice for their ideal of truth. So in this way then, Nietzsche thinks Christianity committed suicide. I quote to you Nietzsche. What actually triumphed over the Christian God? Christian morality itself. The ever more strictly understood concept of truthfulness translated and sublimated into the scientific conscience, into intellectual cleanliness, at any price, end quote. So it's the Christian desire, truth at all costs, which gave birth to atheism and science that ended up destroying Christianity. And I just want to make clear, and this just shows us how different Nietzsche's value system is to ours. When most people say Christianity gave birth to science, they mean that as a praise of Christianity. When Nietzsche says that, he means it as a critique of science. That science still operates under this religious faith, truth at all costs, that it itself cannot justify. Why are we going out and finding out what all the Beatles are doing, okay? That is not a normal masterly desire. And Nietzsche's own position is that no value should have that transcendental absolute status. X at all costs is always bad, let alone truth. Because for Nietzsche, what sustains life, what sustains life's core commitments is illusion. And so truth at all costs is going to be deeply harmful for life. All right, that's the tangent. I hope you found it interesting. Let's go back to our conversation about what the ascetic ideal means for the aesthetic himself. Again, we saw what it meant for the philosopher, right? For the philosopher, the ascetic ideal, denying one's demands of life, meant the greatest conditions to pursue his own great project. And Nietzsche thinks that's exactly what it means for the ascetic as well. The next obvious question is, what is the aesthetic's great project? And Nietzsche has a brilliant, but I think wrong answer here, like most of philosophy. Willing nothingness. The philosopher denies life for the sake of pursuit of truth. The ascetic denies life for the sake of denying life. The philosopher is chaste because he doesn't want to get nagged. He wants to focus on his work. The ascetic is chaste for chastity's sake. Okay, That's so uncharitable, right? Why does Nietzsche, how could he possibly describe the ascetics as willing nothingness? I think the first thing to say in defense of Nietzsche is that's what ascetics themselves tell you if you listen closely. I mean, think about the goal of Buddhism. Cessation of desire. I'm not talking about the later developments of Buddhism, the Mahayana, the Vajrayana. Think about Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism. What cessation of desire meant was poofing out of existence. You obtain nirvana, you still live, but when you die, it's called parinirvana, the final nirvana, and you just leave. And that makes sense, right? Life is a cycle of suffering. Let's end life. I mean, that's a bit of a simplification, but not by much. And I think Nietzsche sees this common strand amongst all the world's mystical traditions. This life is suffering. This life is evil. This life is bad. We need to find a way to end it. Of course, what Nietzsche thinks is actually going on here, what Nietzsche thinks is actually happening, is that some people are predisposed to make that judgment because of their natures, because they're naturally sickly, right? They're naturally gloomy, they're naturally depressive. If you read the commentary on the Buddha's early life, you'll know that he's a naturally gloomy, depressive figure. But not all of us are like that. So when someone tells you all life is suffering, for Nietzsche, again, think back to the hominin, think back to Socrates is ugly. That tells you a lot more about who they are than what life is. So here's an example. In this Tibetan monastery that I was at, I talked to a meditator, a practitioner who was in her 60s. And she had practiced for about 35, 40 years. And she told me, after 30 years of practice and reading and meditation, I finally sensed that the Buddhists were right. I finally could see for myself that at the core of all desire was suffering. And Nietzsche's reading of that is that she didn't learn some objective truth. She got tricked. She's naturally healthy. She's naturally healthy. She doesn't have to interpret the world as all life is suffering. But if all you hear for 30 years is all life is suffering, all life is suffering, all life is suffering, that's what you're going to start to see in everything. Self is an illusion. The ego, that's an illusion. We want to get to the objective reality. That's what we're trying to do. And again, I think Nietzsche has a brilliant, but ultimately wrong, response here, which is that he says, objective reality is an oxymoron. Think about it. All reality requires some form of subject. All life is necessary perspectival. It's from a certain perspective for Nietzsche. There's no God-eyes view to escape to, and even if there were, it would be one among many perspectives. So when you tell me, I want to transcend perspectives, I want to get to objectivity, I want to leave subjectivity, life itself is subjectivity. What you're really telling me is you want to end life, and we're back to willing nothingness. And by the way, this is another intuition that Nietzsche thinks science got from religion, this desire to get to an objective realm, this desire to seek perspective-less truths. And Nietzsche thinks that's totally misguided. All right, so we solved the puzzle of the ascetic. And the answer to the riddle is this: man would much rather will nothingness than not will. What Nietzsche is saying here is that our will to power is so strong that we would actively use our will to power to will nothingness than just to stop using our will to power. So the Buddhists, they're not seizing desire, they're desiring cessation. Think about how active, how will to power Buddhist monastic life is. I'm going to give you one last example to really drive this home. Do you know what the first law from the first Council of Nicaea was? This is one of the most important events in all of early Christian history, convened by Constantine himself, establishing core doctrines of the faith. The literal first law, first canon law, was do not chop your penis off. And the reason was because too many early ascetics in Christianity were chopping their penises off. And that's exactly what Nietzsche has in mind here. Man would rather will nothingness than not will. Okay, in this domain, willing would be having sex. Not willing would be being chaste, but with the penis attached. Actively willing nothingness is actively chopping it off. And I do think it's a very interesting insight that early aesthetics would rather actively chop their penises off than just leave it on and not use it. And Nietzsche's reading here, again, is that our will to power is so strong. I mean, think about the balls it takes, okay, to chop off your balls. That's will to power right there. All right, so we solved the riddle of the aesthetic ideal. What appears to be not willing is really the will to power, directed in two avenues: social control or the willing of nothingness, which means, again, life denial, denying one's core instincts. And Nietzsche spends so much time drawing out this distinction, making sure we're seeing the ascetics as willing nothingness for three key reasons. The first reason is that he wants you to start viewing the priests as just as hypocritical as the slaves, right? Because the priests, they're just as much exercising their will to power as the masters. And the second reason, once you get into this frame, once you start seeing the priests as exercising their will to power, you start looking at the object to which they exercise their will to power. And that's nothingness. And I think Nietzsche wants you to realize that's a very stupid goal. In other words, if we're going to have to use will to power, might as well direct it somewhere fun, like the masters, like orgies and conquest and tragedy and festivals, and not something stupid like cutting your penis off. The third reason that Nietzsche wants to make sure we understand the ascetic as willing nothingness is that he wants to set up how the priests manage to convince everyone else, both master and slave, to also adopt this ideal, to also will nothingness. So that's going to be the final topic we're going to reconstruct in Nietzsche's genealogy. The riddle we need to solve now is, why did this ascetic ideal, again, denying one's life's core instincts, why did it spread to people who weren't priests, who didn't have transcendence as their main goal, to people like you and me? Nietzsche's answer is that it appealed to two constants within human nature: cruelty and suffering. We're going to talk about cruelty first. So Nietzsche's claim is that humans all want to exercise cruelty. And the example he gives are how chimps and monkeys delight in violence, how ancient cultures make out of pain what he calls a festival. Whether this is looking at the Colosseum, whether this is going to beheadings as if it were like an amusement park. That's something people used to do, right? Public executions were seen as a festivity. And we can even see this desire to exercise violence and cruelty on others, Nietzsche thinks, in our modern day, right? I mean, for today, it would be the sheer amount of violence in our media that we consume, in our video games and our movies. The issue with this desire, the desire to exercise violence and cruelty on others, is that civilization cannot permit it, right? Civilization can't permit you to exercise violence all the time. Otherwise, it's going to disrupt civilization. So Nietzsche thinks, without an external target of cruelty, we turn this cruelty internally. And then we adopted the ascetic ideal. I quote to you Nietzsche: "All instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn themselves inward." This is what I call the internalizing of man. So he's giving us what is called a hydraulic view of human desire, right, of water pressure. If it doesn't come out one way, it's going to have to come out another way. Thus first grows in man that which he later calls his soul, the entire inner world, originally thin as if inserted between two skins, has spread and unfolded, has taken on depth, breadth, height, to the same extent that man's outward discharging has been obstructed. So this cruelty is not totally negative, right? It gave us our inner life. Hostility, cruelty, pleasure and persecution, in assault, in change and destruction, all of that turning itself against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of bad conscience. Nietzsche's observation is that civilizations and cultures that give people avenues to let loose their cruelty, that maybe even makes a spectacle out of cruelty, like the Greeks. The people there, they end up like the jocks. They're quite light-hearted, funnily enough, and jovial. But cultures like our own, that think cruelty is something to be swept away under the rug, that thinks it's something avoidable, that it's bad, people end up gloomy because we turn this cruelty onto ourselves. And what Nietzsche, I think, is gesturing at when he talks about self-cruelty does include things like physical harm, right? We cut ourselves, deny ourselves our core instincts. Suicide is obviously the most extreme example. But I think what he also has in mind is mental harm. Think about the immense negative internal dialogue that we have about ourselves. You're not enough, you're fat, you're lazy, you're stupid. And I do think it's a very interesting insight that when we talk to ourselves in that way, we use the second person, you, and not I. And that, I think, is because Nietzsche thinks this drive for cruelty gave us an inner world. It made us both the subject and object of punishment. But there's a problem with self-cruelty, which is why? Why am I being cruel to myself, right? I need some kind of reason. So the priests invented an ingenious solution. You are guilty. You are to blame. You are to be faulted. I quote you Nietzsche. Guilt before God. This thought becomes an instrument of torture for him. In God, he captures the most extreme opposites he can find to his actual and inescapable animal instincts. He reinterprets these animal instincts themselves as guilt before God, as hostility, rebellion, insurrection against the Lord, the Father, the primal ancestor and beginning of the world. The interesting insight here that I think Nietzsche is highlighting is that the concept of original sin is not a bug, but a feature. We actually like it because it enables us to maximally exert self-cruelty unto ourselves. And of course, this type of self-cruelty is none other than the ascetic ideal, committing violence to oneself, denying oneself our core desires. And so again, the other interesting insight is that even everyday people like you and me, we've adopted this ascetic ideal, even to a less extreme extent. But there's another pathway, which both guilt and the ascetic ideal appeal to people, and that's through the problem of suffering. So for Nietzsche, he got this from Schopenhauer, who got this from the Buddhists, and it's quite a simple idea that life contains a great deal of suffering. Some people might suffer less, like the masters, because they're naturally more healthy, but they also suffer. And the problem with suffering isn't the amount of it or the fact of it, but it's the lack of meaning of suffering. So Nietzsche has this very famous line, "He who has a why can bear with almost any how." And what he means to highlight there is the amount of pain, the amount of struggle we're willing to go through, if it's for a cause, if it's for some narrative, if it's for our friends, our children. So suffering needs a meaning. And Nietzsche thinks that people try to find this meaning by blaming others. And we already talked about how the slaves in part 2 blame the masters. And Nietzsche thinks that the masters in the Greco-Roman world can blame the gods. It was Athena that caused me to spiral into frenzy. But there's an issue with this form of other blame, which is that it doesn't really fully answer the why question. Why is Athena punishing me? Why is that bird of prey attacking me? Why me? And so the priests jump in here with both the idea of guilt and the ascetic ideal and present an ingenious solution. You are suffering not because of someone else, but because you are at fault. I quote to you Nietzsche. Those who suffer make malefactors out of friend, wife, child, and whatever else stands closest to them. I am suffering. For this, someone must be to blame. Thus, every diseased sheep thinks. But his shepherd, the ascetic priest, says to him, "That's right, my sheep. Someone must be to blame for it. But you yourself are this someone. You alone are to blame for it. You alone are to blame for yourself. I am suffering because I made a mistake, because I am guilty, because all of this, life itself, all of my natural desires, is bad. Now, my suffering is given meaning." And I do think it's a very interesting insight that of the 5 major world religions, all of them answer this question of suffering in some sense back to you, right? It's sin in the Abrahamic faiths, and it's the idea of karma in Hinduism and Buddhism. Suffering is no longer blamed on, as it was in other religions, a Manichaean devil, but it's blamed on you. And I do think that's a very interesting insight. You are the reason you're suffering. That's the idea of guilt. And you can stop suffering by denying yourself. That's the ascetic ideal. So both of these pathways appeal to the slave as well as the master, but they appeal to the slave a bit more because the master has external channels to unleash his cruelty, and he suffers less to begin with. But the key thing is, this also appealed to the master because the Greco-Roman world didn't have a compelling answer to these questions. So we're now ready to give Nietzsche's full answer to the question why Christianity won. On one hand, Christianity inverted master morality and fed into the resentment of the slaves. On the other hand, by negating life, by blaming the individual, by creating guilt, it created both an outlet for cruelty that had nowhere to go in civilization, and was also able to give suffering a meaning. So the answer that Nietzsche gives for why Christianity won is a psychological one, right? He appeals to factors like resentment, that's the first essay in the genealogy, cruelty, that's the second essay in the genealogy, and suffering, that's the third essay in the genealogy. Obviously, we have to ask, how far can this line of critique go? Why can't Christianity both be true and be promulgated by perverse psychology? Think about it like this. Does the climate scientist have perverse incentives to exaggerate their findings, to play into apocalyptic fears, to get funding to make themselves feel important? Yes. Is climate change happening? It is. Was Churchill a warmonger? He was. Were the Nazis an actual threat? They were. So why can't Christianity both be the result of perverse psychology and also be true? Nietzsche isn't attacking the heart of the problem. Surely the heart of the problem, the only question that matters, is Jesus the Son of God? Nothing else matters. There's two things to say here in Nietzsche's defense. The first thing is that, again, remember, Nietzsche's giving us a polemic here. That's how he conceives his own book. So he's not trying to give you a metaphysical argument for why God can't be, but he's trying to have you lose this taste in slave morality. And the best way he thinks that he can do that is, again, by showing you the hypocritical personalities that promulgated it. But there's a second thing to say in defense of Nietzsche, and it's a bit stronger, which is that it's not just a polemic. I think what Nietzsche is giving us here is what he thinks is the most likely account for how these religions came to be. And he's saying that it's much more reasonable and likely that these religions, the fact that they pop up everywhere with very similar structures, is due to common structures in our psychology that they appeal to, and not because the Buddha actually got enlightened or Jesus is actually the Son of God. And I think this route of critique, that religion is really a psychological phenomenon, is a deeply important one today. Because when most people convert today, what do they tell you? They appeal to their psychology, right? It's no longer miracles, it's no longer reason in Scripture. It's, I was feeling down, and God filled a hole in me. God made me feel whole. Or it's, I was so lost, and in the Buddha, in the Sangha, and the Dharma, I felt in a refuge. I think Nietzsche's clever response here is it's precisely because religion solves your psychological needs that you should be suspicious of it. Because that's the much more likely reason that it's spread, and not because it's actually true. Personally, even if I disagree with the exact mechanisms, like resentment that Nietzsche highlighted, I think this is a very compelling mode of critique of religion, that it's really just a psychological phenomenon. And so even though Nietzsche did not end my quest as a spiritual religious seeker, I'm still actively seeking, he set an incredibly high epistemic hurdle for me to clear. Okay, so that's the genealogy, and I've already told you what I found most compelling, what I think we need to rescue from these pages. The mechanism of resentment, the tension between egalitarianism and greatness, the validity of the ad hominem, and the insight into asceticism. Now, in this last part, part 4, I want to share with you 3 ways in which I think this book is terribly limited and flawed. The will to power, the sovereign individual, and Nietzsche's life itself. The first idea I want to introduce is that certain philosophers have certain biases or predispositions for the type of explanations they like to give, right? So the Anglos, they always give the most base and boring psychological explanations for anything. It was because he calculated his utils and optimized his Sharpe ratio. Nietzsche's the exact opposite. He always gives us the most extravagant and the most cynical possible reading of human motivation, which makes them interesting to read, but I don't think it makes them right. Why are the Christians compassionate? Resentment. How do we develop an inner world? Our unrelenting drive for self-cruelty. And I think this is the most ridiculous instance of that exaggerated cynicism. I quote to you Nietzsche. By prescribing love of one's neighbor, the ascetic priest is basically prescribing an arousal of the strongest, most life-affirming drive, even if in the most cautious of doses, the will to power. So what Nietzsche is saying here is that when we help others, we like it because we feel superior. And look, that's maybe a reasonable idea, right? Because we're helping you, because I'm helping you, it means I have more power. But what I take issue with is the word basically, as if all there is to helping others is just this desire of superiority. I think what's actually going on here is that Nietzsche himself is very high will to power, and so he's actually projected that psychology onto too much humanity. And look, there are people like that. I think I'm very high will to power. I think my progressive acquaintance is very high will to power. This is why we can't stand losing. This is why if we can't win the current value system, we fell prey to resentment, right? That we had to flip the value system. But I don't think most people are like that. I think most people are totally fine with affirming value systems that don't affirm themselves. And this brings me back to that question I raised in the middle of our lecture. Is resentment the perversion or the essence of egalitarian movements, Christianity, socialism, communism, feminism, animal rights activism? I think it's merely the perversion. It might be a likely perversion, right? Someone like Tertullian might be a good example, very high will to power. But I don't think it's the essence. I think there's a lot more going on here than just resentment. This also means that I think there's a lot more to asceticism than just will to power. There's something real that the Buddhists have uncovered through meditation, even if it is clouded by a lot of this will to power that Nietzsche rightfully identifies. But that's not the extent of it. Okay, so that's the first issue. But I think he reads way too much will to power into human nature. The second issue is that whenever Nietzsche talks about a positive ideal, which granted is quite limited because this book is a critical book, it's always of a heroic individualism. Okay, it's always of a lone man creating some new value system. And even in the genealogy, this comes out in his discussion of what he calls the sovereign individual. I quote to you Nietzsche. The sovereign individual, the individual resembling only himself, free from the morality of custom, autonomous and supermoral. The free human being, the possessor of a long, unbreakable will, has in this possession his standard of value as well. Looking from himself towards the others, he honors or holds in contempt. Nietzsche's positive ideal is always a lone individual. To frame it in other words, he's suspicious of any form of sociality. And my issue with that is that I just think it's naive and impossible. Maybe I've read too much Girard and Hegel, but I think sociality always interpenetrates us. And we always evaluate with a group or against a group or building on top of a group, and we can't be sane in our evaluative judgments without receiving some kind of recognition. In other words, one big issue I have in the psychology of the master that Nietzsche detailed is his claim that the indifference of the master comes from his genetics, comes from his nature. I don't think that's where it comes from. I think it comes from sociality. In other words, the jock can only be so indifferent to others because others are not indifferent to him, because they praise him, they give him their recognition. So that's my second issue, right? Nietzsche's heroic individualism. But my biggest issue with this book has nothing to do with the ideas in this book. It has to do with the life that produced it and was produced by it, Nietzsche's life. If Nietzsche blames Socrates' decadent metaphysical speculation on his ugliness, then I would blame Nietzsche's obsession with power and individuality on him being a loser. So let me be clear on what I mean that Nietzsche is a loser. I'm not talking about his early years, which seemed fine except for the early death of his father and brother. I'm not talking about his fantastic early philological career, where he was made the youngest professor at the University of Bonn. I'm talking about the mature Nietzsche, the Nietzsche who wrote books like these. I'm talking about his chronic sickness that eventually became insanity. I'm talking about barely scraping by with a university pension. I'm talking about his rejection by multiple women that turned someone who was an early supporter of women's education into a cartoon misogynist. I'm talking about a man who conceived of himself as the next Socrates, but had so little recognition in his sane years that he had to self-fund the publishing of his books. If Nietzsche tells us that every philosophy is an intimate confession by their philosopher, what I hear in Nietzsche's confession is seething, unrelenting anger at an unreceptive world. And I think that's directly linked to the two ways in which his ideas are actually flawed. It's related to this first point, that he exaggerates will to power, because remember, Nietzsche himself tells us the master does not think about power. In fact, the master doesn't really think, period. It's the slave, it's the priest, it's the people who don't have power on the sidelines. Those are the ones who are conniving. Those are the ones who are resentful and thinking of power. And I think Nietzsche was only such a masterful psychologist of resentment because he was also a creature of resentment. And you hear that through the seething anger, through his work and through his pages. So I think the exaggerated emphasis on the will to power tells us perhaps a bit less about the Christian psyche than the psyche of Nietzsche himself. And I think the same goes for his heroic individualism. It just reeks of these avant-garde artists who receive no recognition, and then they say, anyone who's recognized in their own life is a failure. I think the heroic individual is the ideal through which Nietzsche tried to turn his lack of reception into a triumph. But of course, it's not an ideal that Nietzsche could actually inhabit. You can say you don't care. You can say I can evaluate by myself all you want. Nietzsche, I think, deeply cared what people thought of him, and I think it deeply bothered him that he was unrecognized in his sane years. I quote to you Nietzsche's biographer describing the beginning of Nietzsche's insanity. In Nietzsche's mind, the tentative contacts his friend had made on his behalf with quite average people, moreover, who were generally interested in but hardly converts to his philosophy, were transformed into a discipleship composed solely of the most elevated natures of exclusively high-placed and influential people in St. Petersburg, in Paris, in Stockholm, in Vienna, in New York. In his mind, he's gone crazy at this point, he had become incredibly famous, a superstar. He says, there is no name that is treated with such reverence as mine. Jean Bordeaux, actually no more than an occasional contributor, got promoted to the editor-in-chief of a prestigious French journal in Nietzsche's mind, and as such, the most influential man in France. In reality, far from admiring Nietzsche, Bordeaux regarded his writings as cruel and perverse. This is a man who deeply cared what other people thought of him. And so, I have the exact opposite issue that most people have of Nietzsche. Most people are suspicious of Nietzsche because he parades the values of the winner. I'm suspicious of Nietzsche because he lived the life of a loser. And when you look at who is attracted to Nietzsche's ideas today, I'm not talking about the academics. I'm talking about the real people in the real world who uncritically embrace all of Nietzsche. It's never the Übermensch. It's never the blonde beast. It's never the jock. More often than not, it's people like Nietzsche, sickly, marginalized, unattractive, resentful. Let me be totally clear here. Nietzsche had his dark side, and that's what I'm focusing on, because we're talking about the limitations of his work, and I think it's inextricably connected to the limitations of his life. But he had a positive, a yes-saying, a value-creating side as well. And Nietzsche is undoubtedly, in my mind, one of the great geniuses of the 20th century. So much so that even my fundamental critique of Nietzsche is Nietzschean through and through. It was Nietzsche that taught me the validity of the ad hominem. So let me end our lecture by expressing both my deep indebtedness, my deep gratitude for Nietzsche, as well as my ultimate dissatisfaction with him in the following way. I've been too convinced by Nietzsche to be convinced by the rhetoric of the sick. Thank you. Thanks for watching my lecture. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you understand the most important books in history. Now, one thing you might be interested in after this lecture is to explore Nietzsche's critique of free will, which we briefly touched upon. Now, Nietzsche has very interesting arguments for why free will is an illusion and how we can live life without it. If that interests you, go check out my interview with Professor Brian Leiter. You can find the links to everything we discussed today, including transcripts and my book notes in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. I think, reading your book very closely, that there's actually another argument in addition to this first one about why we identify with the command when it comes to the phenomenology of the will, which is that our thoughts themselves, the thought, I will raise my hand, itself is not willed. Can you elaborate on that argument?
Okay. Yes. So Nietzsche does think, right, that it is a striking fact, as he puts it, that a thought comes when it wants, not when I want.
What does he mean by that? Elaborate there.
What he means is that for most of our thoughts, there is no sense in which we even have the experience of free will with them. We just find ourselves with the thought, right? And I think this is a correct observation about even the internal phenomenology of it. Occasionally, right, if we're, running through an argument in our head, it may start to feel like we're willing it. But with an awful lot of thoughts that we have, we find ourselves with them, right? And a thought precedes an action. But if the thought comes when it wants, if I didn't will the thought into being, right? And even if the thought caused the action, I still wouldn't be responsible for the action because I wasn't responsible for the thought. Because it came upon me, I didn't will it into being. That's the point of this argument.
Right. And my pushback, as you can tell, I'm quite sympathetic to the free will position, is why then is there a gradation of experience of willing? Like you said, when we're having this conversation right now, you said in our break that it was very tenuous because it feels like you're having to expend a lot of will to do it. There are thoughts.
No, I didn't say anything about will.
In my phenomenology, it feels like I'm being very engaged. Now,
I'm being engaged, but the point is, what I'm objecting to is the use of the word will.
Right.
Right. This is intense, right? But I don't feel like I'm exercising a lot of free will in this.
Right.
I'm kind of on, my Nietzsche autopilot.
Okay.
To put it that way, which is, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm responding to things you're saying, and arguments come to mind, and a lot of thoughts come to mind just because you say something, but I don't, as it were, will them into my mind.
Right. Well, let me draw out, I think, the weaker version of this claim, which still, I think, is going to be fine for my point, which is there are certain thoughts, like you say, that feel a lot less willed. In fact, there are certain thoughts where you try not to will them into existence, like don't think about a pink elephant, right? People think about a pink elephant. Why is there this gradation of the feeling of willing a thought if all of them are unwilled?
Okay.
Do you agree with that, by the way?
I'm not sure
gradation?
I think there's a gradation. What I think is that sometimes we may have the experience of free will with our thoughts. And the example I gave is we're working through an argument that has logical steps.
Yes, right.
But I think that's relatively infrequent. And it's not true of most of our thoughts.
But that's fine, right? Because the free will person doesn't say everything needs to be the outcome of free will. But
okay. But notice, right, it would have to be the case that the thoughts that precede action have to be thoughts where we have the experience of free will with them, right? And that would be a very small subset of the actions where I think we feel we have free will. So you'd already lose quite a lot.
That's fine, yeah.
Right. Well, it's not going to be fine for most defenders of free will. But secondly, even that, right, even that argument is potentially vulnerable to the first argument, namely that the phenomenology admits of a debunking explanation, right? That we feel like we are willing the thought that precedes the action because it contributes to the feeling of power.
One last point on this argument that Nietzsche provides us. If all of our will is a mere symptom or it's an epiphenomenon of really underlying unconscious activities,
Yeah.
why do we have consciousness? Why aren't we just unconscious automatons?
Right. Okay, so Nietzsche's view about this, and again, I think it's a kind of prescient view from the standpoint of contemporary psychology, is that he thinks most of our mental life can proceed unconsciously. And we actually now know that this is true, that a huge amount of our mental life does proceed unconsciously. And he takes up the question, why is any part of it conscious, right? His answer to the question why any part of our mental life becomes conscious is because that was necessary basically for society, right? That some of our mental activity had to become conscious, which for Nietzsche means had to be formulatable in language. Language and consciousness go hand in hand for Nietzsche. He's quite explicit about that. Language developed and consciousness developed in order to make social coordination much more effective, right? I can do a tremendous amount of what I need to do mentally unconsciously, but if you and I are to coordinate, right, so that we catch the tiger, we're going to have to talk, right? We're going to have to be able to share some of our mental life with each other in order to have a community, do the things needed to sustain the community. So that's his hypothesis, not a crazy hypothesis, that it facilitated a kind of social coordination that would have been impossible if all mental activity were unconscious. That's his answer.
Right. So I'm having a bit of trouble with his hypothesis because it's not clear to me why language and communication, out of all the different faculties, is what necessitated consciousness, because there seems to be other conscious activities that are even more intense than language.
Okay, sorry. So that wasn't quite the thesis.
Right.
The thesis was that consciousness developed in order to facilitate social coordination. And consciousness is only possible with language. So language and consciousness developed to facilitate social coordination. That's the thesis.
Right. I mean, computers certainly communicate without being conscious, but even in the human realm...
Right, but human beings can't.
Right, but I don't know about any studies on this, but surely something about smelling an odor of fear from my companions or something like that unconsciously sets me on tilt, or surely there's ways to communicate that's unconscious, no?
Surely is begging the question
right.
there. It's not obvious that's surely. I mean, I suppose it could have been the case that, look, human beings could have evolved telepathy, right?
Right.
And then that would have, but we didn't. That didn't happen. So might there have been other ways to facilitate social coordination? I guess possibly, but that isn't our species, right? Such as your elevated sense of smell, right? That does all the work that, my telling you there's a snake in the bush does, right? I don't know. The snake in the bush just seems a lot more efficient, right?
Right.
And tell everyone back in the village there's a snake in the bush to stay in their tents, right, or whatever it is. That's the simple idea.
So the two arguments we've covered so far, the first one about the ulterior reasons why people want to invent freedom, as well as this phenomenological deconstruction, as you say, they're not takedowns. So what other reasons does Nietzsche give us for why this position is to be preferred?
So he has a general thesis about why human beings do the things they do, right? And it is that the human mind is kind of a bundle of drives that are mostly unconscious. Drives seek expression in various ways, and their expression involves us doing various things, okay? Now, you can ask the question, why think that picture is true? Answer is he thinks it provides the best explanation of a lot of observable behavior, and it provides a better explanation than, for example, people engage in conscious ratiocination and choose what to do based on their free will, right? I mean, I'm putting it a little crudely here, but that really is the structure of it. Nietzsche is, he's not the first person to theorize the existence of an unconscious, right? But he is one of the first to give a lot of examples and evidence that would support the claim that there are unconscious aspects of mental life that figure in the explanation of our behavior, right? And Freud then picks up on this.
You attempted to bolster this position very helpfully with a lot of contemporary empirical research, mostly focused on how heritability affects us. Here's one quote. Of the total explained variance, 59% was explained by the criminality of the biological parents. We're talking about the criminality of children here. And only 19% was explained by the criminality of the adoptive parents. So if I have a kid, even if the kid is adopted from day one, 59% of the variance of the kid's criminality is not going to be explained by the adoptive parents,
but by your criminality.
By my criminality, right. And so it's really through empirical observations like these that one starts to build a severe doubt of free will. Is that what I'm getting?
That is certainly an important part of the empirical evidence. And this is broadly in the family of what's called behavioral genetics. Behavioral genetics, famously involves two kinds of studies. You mentioned one, which is where a child is adopted into a different family, and we know something about the behavioral character or personality characteristics of the birth parent and of the adoptive parents. And then we see what has the biggest influence. Answer is birth parent, right? Not absolute, but the bigger influence. And then the other are the famous Minnesota twin studies, where twins are separated at birth into two different families for adoption. And then it turns out that, for example, they have very similar personality traits, extroversion, neuroticism. This is how contemporary psychologists talk about the big five personality traits. That the biological parents, the heritability of their personality traits has a lot more to do with explaining that of the kids. Now, what does this suggest, and how is this relevant to Nietzsche? It suggests that, as Nietzsche seems to believe, people have different sort of fundamental psychophysical characteristics. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a gene for extroversion or a gene for neuroticism, all right? The pathway for the heritability could be an interaction between genes and environment. So it can get very complicated. But the point is that there is a sort of a psychological core of the person, right, that is there at birth and manifests itself largely not entirely regardless, but independently of a lot of big differences in environment, right? And Nietzsche does seem to have a view like this. He originally encountered it in Schopenhauer, right? Schopenhauer, famously joked, it was a funny joke because he didn't have kids himself. He said, the children basically arrive with a character and then it just unfolds over their life, but it's continuous throughout. And Nietzsche has a fairly similar view in the sense that, we arrive with sort of a package of drives or dispositions, and the environment may affect them, but it can't fundamentally change the type of person we are.
Right. So what I want to be clear here is on both what determines us completely and how we are determined completely. So it sounds like the first question is a combination of our environment, our unconscious, and our genetics, our nature. And not free will, those things sufficiently explain all of our decisions. And when it comes to how we are influenced, it's not like we are fated to hold a specific belief. I like pink, I like blue. What we are determined on is more like in our personality, if that's a good word.
Yeah.
So I'm a conformist, or I like standing out. And so this leads to the interesting conclusion that the person with the same type fact in different cultures can manifest in completely different ways.
Maybe not completely different, but
right.
Yes, different in some way.
Right. So if I'm a conformist in Los Angeles, I wouldn't want to veil my daughters. But if I'm a conformist in a Muslim country, I would want to veil my daughters. So
I think that's fair.
Despite the superficial difference, there's a deeper similarity.
I think that's right, and I think the example is an apt one. We could, the question is, what are the relevant psychological types? And as I say, contemporary psychology, they talk about extroversion, introversion, neuroticism. There's one or two others in the big five. I forget the other two. Nietzsche talks about slavish psychology, right? He doesn't have sort of a neat map of them. One difference between Nietzsche and Freud is Freud has a simpler set of categories. But I think the basic picture fits your example.
Right. So let me push this one last way. I don't think anyone who is sober in modernity can deny that our genes, our environment, and our unconscious drives can determine what we do. But again, Nietzsche is making a much more totalitarian claim there. He says they fully determine what they do. I'm still not seeing where that argument in everything we discussed today is.
So I'm not sure I want to say everything, right? I believe there was a chair here and I sat down, right? I mean, there was some conscious reasoning that went on that was relevant there. What I think is important for Nietzsche is the claim that it determines, as it were, the most important things, right? Deciding to sit in the chair is not the most important thing I did in my life.
So there is still some room for potential freedom.
Yeah, the target, and this goes back to what I was calling the reasons responsive compatibilism, right? The real target here is what you might call reflective consciousness. This is the term Mattia Riccardi uses in his very good book on Nietzsche's philosophical psychology. It's the kind of reasoning we supposedly engage in when we're making moral decisions, right? Or immoral decisions, or major decisions in our life, right? And there, the radical claim that Nietzsche makes is reflective consciousness is epiphenomenal. It goes back to the discussion we were having about the idea that consciousness and language develop under social pressure, the need for social coordination, right? And what that means is that if the reason parts of our mental life are becoming conscious is so we can facilitate social coordination, then the language we're going to use to describe the relevant bits of our mental lives is only the language that's necessary to facilitate the coordination,
right?
Not necessarily the full complexity of our mental lives.
And it's even worse because it's a display, right? When I'm communicating, I need to sort of put on an appearance.
Well, there's that other complicated feature, right, of social interaction. But before we even get to that, just the simple things, I need to communicate to you that you need to avoid the snake that just bit me in the bushes, right? What you need to know about my mental life and my experience is pretty superficial, right? You need to know it was unpleasant, that snakes bite, right? You don't need to know much more. You don't need to know the full set of feelings and experiences that I had, all my thoughts of snakes, all the nuances of my perception of the snake. In other words, because conscious mental life has as its purpose facilitating social coordination, it can sort of flatten out what's really going on in our mental life. Most of our mental life need not become conscious. And in that regard, therefore, it fundamentally falsifies, as Nietzsche often says. It's a very superficial, only partial representation of the mental events that are actually going on in the mind.
That's fascinating. We're running a bit short on time, so I want to get to part 3 about the prescriptions. What do we do if we buy into Nietzsche's his fatalism? But I just want to, at the end of part 2, I want to make something crystal clear here. I'm fully on board that most of our lives are determined in ways that people think they actually have free agency, whereas they don't. Nietzsche has shown me so many of these pathways that determine our actions or highly push us to certain directions rather than others. But none of this shows that we don't have free will, right? Like there could be an inkling. All Nietzsche wants to argue is the immense ways we are determined. Is that right? Or he wants to go stronger and say the full...
No, I think it's stronger than that if you accept the claims and the evidence that he offers. I mean, the question is, if his picture of the mind is right, then you have to answer the question, where's the will? In what sense is it causally undetermined? If it's causally determined, then now we're back in the Humean Frankfurt camp. But we don't know what determines the action, then how are those arguments supposed to work? So it really does, I think, create a fundamental problem.
A full court press, so to speak, yeah.
Right.
So my position here is I maintain, I'm very, first of all, I'm not a metaphysician, so this is going to be a very naive position, but to me, I don't think anyone has shown conclusively what types of causalities do or even don't exist. Right? Physics, for the longest time, thought it was Newtonian billiard balls crashing together. Now we have quantum. I don't know how that's supposed to help sort of free will, but it's clear that physics has no idea how to square the classical with the quantum. Kant has a great argument, I think, about atemporality. If there's an atemporal realm, then obviously there opens up so many different causalities, modes of causality. And physics is showing us that time is not as simple as we thought it was, right? And then there's the argumentation that we're not sure that this is base reality. So whether that's a simulated reality, whether that's a religious reality, we have no access to what the real metaphysics could be. So
that last claim I think is absurd, and
Right.
Nietzsche would think it's absurd.
Right.
So I just want to take that. I want to take silly metaphysics, which just embarrasses philosophy,
Right.
off the table.
No,
because the first 2 points I think are more serious.
I'm not saying that there is a base reality. There is an alternate reality. I'm saying it's not clear to me that there isn't. So I'm holding the skeptical position. I'm not arguing that any of those things I said are true. I'm saying I'm a skeptic. I've read as many people as I could on this topic, and no one seems to have any idea on not just what type of causality there are, but also what type of causality there aren't. And if I'm a skeptic, if theory is so impotent, then I just trust my phenomenology. Sometimes I feel like I'm in control. Sometimes I feel like I'm the driver's seat.
Let me say, if you're really that kind of skeptic, which Nietzsche has no truck with, and I don't find very plausible, if you're really that kind of skeptic, that hardly helps the case for free will, right? I mean, why think there's free will if, in fact, this is all a simulation?
Oh, I'm saying
example.
I distrust theory, so I just default to my phenomenology. I default to my experience.
Well, that doesn't seem to follow from that kind of skepticism. But again, let's put aside the sci-fi fantasy stuff. I know philosophers love this stuff, but you've studied philosophy. Philosophers have no judgment.
Right. There we go.
On the causality question, notice nothing in Nietzsche's arguments depends on the difference between causality in a Newtonian and a quantum world.
Right.
It's just none of it turns on that. It does turn on having some notion of causal determination, and you could pick a Humean view of causation, you could pick a non-Humean view of causation. I'm perfectly happy with certain kinds of constant conjunctions, right? But Nietzsche doesn't have a lot to say about this question. It turns out, Riccardi talks about this actually in his book, that Nietzsche was familiar with Humean views on causation and found them kind of attractive. So I'm not sure that the genuine problem in the physics matters for purposes of Nietzsche's argument, as long as you think there's some notion of causal determination of the kind we employ all the time in ordinary life that's will suffice here. That, I think, is really all Nietzsche says. Nothing in Nietzsche rules out the sort of, extravagant metaphysical scenarios.
Right. And that's what I was precisely trying to deny by bringing up the physics, to say that, the physicists have no idea of what type of causalities there are and there aren't. And anyways.
But we still have a notion of causality that we use all the time.
Right.
And when I go to the doctor, I count on the doctor having a plausible view about causality, or I'm not going to get better.
Right. And I'm just skeptical about drawing too many conclusions from that ordinary language. That's what I'm trying to say.
It's not ordinary language. I mean, doctors work with the notion of causation all the time on the basis of which they recommend treatments, right? And they are not affected at all by the physics.
Right.
And God bless them for that.
We have to move to the third part, which I think is the most interesting part. Why does all this matter? If we buy in to Nietzsche, how does he want us to live? Can we even live as if we don't have free will?
Good. Yes, that's certainly a very important question. Nietzsche does think illusion is a necessary condition for life. And I think one of those illusions is the illusion that we have free will, okay? But I still think, so even from the first personal standpoint, if that illusion is pretty hard to resist, right? I do think giving up belief in free will and giving up belief in moral responsibility does have a very important effect on how you think about other people and think about practices of praise and blame and what you're actually doing.
Legal philosophy, which is your specialty.
Yeah, well, there are implications in legal philosophy. I mean, look, there's a contemporary philosopher, Dirk Pierboom, who has something basically like Nietzsche's view, not for Nietzsche's reasons. And he says, therefore, we can't base punishment on desert, right? Retribution, right? Because people aren't blameworthy. He says we ought to think of punishment on the model of quarantine, right? That is, certain types of people are criminal by nature, okay? Now, I've tried to explain to him that as a matter of criminal policy, this is crazy, right? Because, you can see very well where that would lead, right? Unless there's a crime gene, it would just be very creepy, right? So in a way, I think the criminal law probably does it the right way. You have to perform a wrongful act, and there has to be some evidence of your mental state. I think it's largely fiction, but I think that's perfectly fine for criminal policy. I think more about how we think about individuals. So, for example, I am never comfortable with saying anybody is evil. It just doesn't, and this is the Nietzsche influence to me. I think there are certain types of people who do certain things by nature, and they're abhorrent, but are they blameworthy? I'm kind of skeptical.
But the good isn't blameworthy either. That's the flip side of this, right?
The good isn't
praiseworthy.
Isn't praiseworthy, at least when praise is directly symmetrical to blame, right? You can admire Beethoven without thinking that he exercised free will to become Beethoven. You could admire Nietzsche and agree with Nietzsche's own self-assessment that it was fate that he be Nietzsche, right? And so you could still admire, the genius, the prose. It was just a lucky stroke of nature. And there are lucky and unlucky strokes of nature. And I do think that would lead us to, as it were, be a little less moralizing and a little less prone to sort of blame and vindictiveness about things, even though it wouldn't change the need for punishment and so on.
So if I understand your position right, you're saying that we still have to live and operate as if we had free will. That's what...
From the first person's standpoint.
Right, from the first person's perspective, it's what's required of agency, really, to make decisions and do things. But you're saying what this view should change is to transform our relationship with others.
I think it transforms how we perceive others. I think it can also transform how we perceive ourselves, right? That is, if you understand that a lot of what you're doing is more fated than you realize, then you can view, part of what you do in a human life as learning who you really are. And that's roughly what Nietzsche said about himself. That is, you can perhaps acquire a more realistic sense of who you are by observing your life, not from the phenomenological perspective, but what have you done? What choices have you made? What things have happened to you? What kinds of relationships have you had? And so on and so forth. So I do think that's another takeaway from this.
Let me ask you another question, and this has to do with the idea that Nietzsche thinks we shouldn't reject an idea just because it is false, but on its impact to life. Nietzsche wants to create higher men. Creative genius, sometimes he refers to the conquerors as well. A constitutive quality of these higher men, so to speak, seem to be that they exaggerate their own agency, right? Caesar thinking that he was fated to rule Rome, or Nietzsche thinking that he's
Notice what you just said.
Right,
Caesar
right.
thought he was fated. I'm not sure they exaggerate their own agency. They may have enormous self-confidence. Or in Caesar's case, actually think they are agents of fate.
Yeah.
Right.
This is very helpful. When I said it, I realized I had sort of trapped myself.
You had given me
I'd given you
ammunition
something.
for my view.
It's interesting. So Nietzsche's claim here could be that if you think everything is determined, you will actually act with much more ferocity.
Maybe, but again, I think Nietzsche would be perfectly happy to grant that from the first person standpoint, when we're thinking about what to do,
we should exaggerate.
We act as though we are exercising free will, right? And that's one of those illusions you can't get away with. I mean, you can't eliminate that one. It's really tough to think about yourself the way you might think about your dog, right? Your dog doesn't have free will, but you can't think about yourself that way, right? Whether great human beings think of themselves as exercising free will, I think it's an interesting empirical question. But the Caesar example is funny in that regard, because he really did have this sense of fate, destiny, right? And that is something I've seen recur in biographies I've read, actually, of certain
higher men, so to speak, right?
Or just a sense of, an absolute certainty of purpose, right? So it's not a matter of agency, it's just, this is what I must do, right? And I do think that's how Nietzsche thinks about his own life, though, as in his autobiography he says, he only came to realize that over time, that he saw what was unfolding in him.
Right.
Right.
This conversation corrected, I think, a wrong assumption I had come in with, which is that you have to exaggerate your own freedom to really act with purpose. But it seems like if you go the opposite extreme, if you think you're fated to do something, then that could be another motivating push. Now, we're running out of time. I want to ask you one last topic.
Yeah.
One last Nietzschean prescription if we don't accept free will. Becoming who one is. Tell us about this idea.
So Nietzsche famously says one becomes what one is without having the slightest idea what one is, right? And that's consistent in a way with the point we were just discussing, right? That we may be more fated to lead our lives in certain ways than we realize, right? And but we're going to lead our lives in that way regardless of whether we know it. And this is why figuring out who one is a matter of discovery, even for the individual, him or herself.
Right.
Just as I might discover it by observing you, I discover it by observing myself as well. Right?
So this, I think, is the practical takeaway, which is that self-improvement or child rearing isn't about trying to get yourself or your child to achieve some kind of abstract ideal of virtues of, I don't know, patience and humility. It's more about observation. What type of creature am I? And then living a suitable life for that type of person. Is that right?
I think that's roughly right. And I will say, as a parent of 3 children, it is very important as a parent to understand who the children are, to understand that character they have arrived with, and not to make certain kinds of demands.
Not to force them into a certain mold.
Too foreign to it. You don't make assumptions that limit their possibilities, but you do have to really be alert to who they are and what they're capable of and how and when and their proclivities and so on.
One consequence, however, we might not like it, is that I think Nietzsche's theory must make us judge people a lot harsher based on their past. So if you committed criminality, that wasn't just a choice. You're by nature disposed to criminality. If you cheated once, you're by nature disposed to that. Is that a conclusion?
I think that's too strong. Cheated once, committed one crime. But I do think that your basic intuition is right, which is that the fact that someone did something and maybe did it multiple times starts to be strong evidence about who they really are, right? And so yes, in that sense, the past, not just a once-off, but a past set of actions is strong evidence to the type of person that you really are, in a way that you wouldn't associate with the free will view, right? Oh, they just chose to do it. No. This is telling us something deep about their nature.
Right. So it's harder for people to change in this framework.
On this picture, yes. There's limits to how much change you can expect.
I don't think I'm more convinced about not having free will, but I think what you have shown me is the tremendous pathways that we are being determined, and which makes me able to take away a lot of these practical prescriptions, even without fully ejecting free will. So I want to thank you for this interview.
You're very welcome. Thank you for all the good questions.
Thanks for watching my interview.